All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I think most people have got on, and we'll just continue to, we'll go ahead and get started and let other people get on. So Tracy, do you want to go ahead and start?
Hello, and welcome to the May 16th Aerial Fire Retardant, the Forest Service, and You webinar. My name is Tracy Hickman. I'm on the Umatilla National Forest in Northeast Oregon, and I'm a team member of the 5-year review team. This Aerial Fire Retardant Review Team webinar has been developed based on the findings of a national review conducted this past winter. Many Forest Service employees, both in natural resources and fire operations, expressed a need for new or additional training regarding the 2011 Record of Decision. In addition, due to the normal turnover in personnel, many employees haven't participated in local level training or previous webinars. Today you will be provided the information and tools needed to implement the 2011 direction to assure the continued use of aerial fire retardant on National Forest Service lands. It is the responsibility of personnel from both fire operations and natural resources and other agency personnel such as line officers to know the protocols and reporting requirements when aerial fire retardant is used during wildland firefighting operations. Today we'll cover many components of the 2011 Record of Decision and associated biological opinions. We are expecting hundreds of webinars for these 3 webinars, hundreds of participants for the 3 webinars. Please type your questions in the chat box as the webinar proceeds, and they will be answered in real time, and if there is time at the end of the webinar, the most common questions will also be answered. We are capturing all questions submitted, and the questions and answers will be posted with the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. The website address for the recording will be posted on the last slide, and the best webinar will be the final one posted on the website. The last webinar is on June 6th and will contain the same content. There are 4 segments in the webinar led by 4 presenters, and at the end of the webinar, their names and phone numbers will be displayed. The first segment is Background of Fire Chemicals, led by Shirley Zylstra. Shirley is the program leader for wildland fire chemicals at the National Technology and Development Program in Missoula, Montana. Shirley manages the testing and qualification of any new wildland fire chemical and also oversees the Forest Service specifications and qualified products list for fire chemicals. Shirley has a Bachelor's of Science degree from Oregon State University and a Master's degree in Environmental Toxicology from Colorado State University. The second segment is an overview of the Aerial Fire Retardant Program, led by Julie Loftman. Julie is a natural resource planner with the National Technology and Development Program in Missoula. Julie was one of the original team members on the Aerial Fire Retardant EIS and continues to manage all national reporting requirements, the implementation guide, the avoidance mapping process, and participates as the co-lead of new science related to fire chemical and fish toxicity studies with the USGS. Julie has a master's in biochemistry from the University of Tennessee and a doctorate in ecology from Colorado State University. The third segment covers resource advising and reporting, led by Dave Austin. Since 2009, Dave has been the forest biologist and program manager for wildlife, fish, botany, and range for the San Bernardino National Forest. He was one of the original team members on the 2011 EIS and is now on the team as a lead wildlife biologist. Dave maintains qualifications as a lead resource advisor, helicopter manager, and agency representative. Dave has a Bachelor of Science degree from Humboldt State University in wildlife management. The fourth segment is an overview of air operations and application of aerial fire retardant, led by Robert Budge. Rob is currently the Deputy Fire Staff for Fuels for the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. In addition to the Forest Fuels Program, he oversees fire prevention, fire planning, and is Wildland Fire Decision Support System lead for the forest. During the summer, Rob is the Air Operations Branch Director on a Type 2 team. The Aerial Fire Retardant Team wants to emphasize continued cooperation and teamwork between fire operations and natural resources is paramount for success of the Aerial Fire Retardant Program. Okay, Shirley, you're up first.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I hope so. Okay, thanks, Tracy. Again, my name is Shirley Zylstra. and today I plan to briefly cover why we use chemicals on fires, some of the basic qualification tests that we run them through before they're allowed to be used out on federal wildlands, some of the types and categories of fire chemicals, and then some of the characteristics of those chemicals. So chemicals, and that includes water, they're not designed to put fire out by themselves. They're intended to be used as a tool to decrease the intensity of a fire and to slow the rate of the fire's spread. This allows time for ground crews to do their work, and it also increases safety for firefighters. All chemicals have their limits, and they may not be all that useful in extreme fire conditions, especially in high winds. For ground crews, those extreme conditions would be when the flame lengths are greater than about 4 feet. And for other equipment, such as engines or bulldozers, those flame lengths might be more like 8 feet, after which the chemicals might not be very helpful. So when we're looking at fire chemicals, before they're used out on the ground, we run them through a series of tests. These tests are dictated to us, or no, what's the word I'm looking for? The policy is that any of these chemicals have to go through these tests before they can be used out in wildland. Some of the different tests that we run on these products are corrosion, the effectiveness, how well it slows down or stops the fire, the stability, so we want to know how cold temperature cycling or warm temperature cycling might affect the products. And we also look at the toxicity, both mammalian or human health toxicity and aquatic toxicity. So when we're looking at chemicals, we divide them into 3 broad categories. They're either a foam, a gel, or water enhancer, or a retardant. So I'm going to start out talking about the foams first. Foams affect how fast the water drains. They're basically, they're like a real strong dishwashing detergent. So they contain ingredients that allow them to foam, as you would expect, but they also contain ingredients called surfactants, which break down the surface tension of water. That surfactant action of foams makes them unique with between the different types of products, and it allows the water that they contain to absorb into fuels more effectively and more efficiently than it would if we were just using plain water. The active ingredient in these chemicals is the water itself. We're just changing some of the characteristics. So because of that, they're only useful as long as that water they contain is still there. Once that water evaporates, then they're no longer effective. And because of that, they're really only a direct attack tool. And when I'm talking about direct attack, I'm referring to essentially we're putting the foam or the chemical directly on the flame. We're not putting it in front of the flame. So the water enhancers or gels are a second category that we evaluate. These products are the active or the ingredients in these products are something called superabsorbent polymers, and they're the same types of things that we find in baby diapers, but basically what they're doing is changing the characteristics of water to make it really thick and sticky, really viscous. And what that does is it allows us to build up basically a thick layer of water on a fuel. So it creates this pretty durable barrier against the fire. It allows us to build up, we can build up maybe a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch thick water layer on a barrier. And there's the picture that you're looking at is a picture of what a gel drop might look like. Again, the active ingredient in these products is the water. So once that water evaporates, the product is no longer effective. And because of that, they too are only really useful as a direct attack tool. In general, when firefighters are using these products, they can assume to get, or they can figure they'll get performance out of a foam for probably just a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20, depending on the conditions. For the water enhancers and gels, we'll get performance a little bit longer than that, maybe 45 minutes or up to an hour, but certainly depending on the environmental characteristics, once that water evaporates, it's no longer effective. The third type of category that we look at are the long-term retardants. And the long-term retardants are different than either the foams or the gels in that all of that water they contain can evaporate, and we can still expect performance out of the product. And that's because these products contain fertilizers. So if you look at that picture of the airplane dropping, 85% of that drop is water, about 10% of that is fertilizer, and the last 5% are things like thickeners and corrosion inhibitors, coloring, stuff like that. 85% of that drop, which is water, can evaporate, and we can still expect performance out of the product. And that's what's unique. So there's a chemical reaction going on between the fertilizer and the heat of the fire, and it's essentially drawing heat out of the fire. It's pulling heat away from the fire to drive that chemical reaction, and it's essentially cooling the fire to the point that it can't sustain itself. Because all that water can evaporate, the long-term retardants are the only true line-building tool that we have, or line-building chemical that we have. Because of that, they are the only indirect chemical, or they're the only chemical that we can use in a true indirect type of attack. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides. So I often get asked about the toxicity of fire chemicals. So in general, they are very, very low toxicity for human health and mammalian, ground-based organisms, basically. Aquatic toxicity can be a different story, particularly with the Class A foams. They can be extremely toxic, and that's because of that surfactant that they contain. Generally, when we're using foams on the ground, the highest concentration we would use them at would be about 1%, but that can still be very, very lethal to fish, particularly if it's introduced in a small stream. The water enhancers are much less toxic than the foams are. The mechanism, I guess, of toxicity is just if you get too much of that water enhancer, it just makes the water really thick. It makes it hard for fish to swim through there, and it can kind of clog up their gills. The long-term retardants are the least toxic as a class, but we use a lot more of them in much greater quantities. The ingredient in the retardants that in general is the most toxic is the ammonia from the fertilizer. So the fertilizer in all the retardants that we use now is something called ammonium phosphate, and the ammonia portion of that is what creates that toxicity in fish. So as I mentioned earlier, the retardants are the only true line-building or indirect attack tool that we have. When a long-term retardant is dropped from an air tanker, it's applied ahead of the fire, as is shown in the picture, and that's what we call direct attack. So you put it in front of the fire, so there's unburned fuel between the fire and the retardant drop. As the fire runs into the leading edge of that retardant, those chemical reactions that I was talking about start to occur, and it slows the fire down and reduces its intensity. so the diagram that just came up on the lower left-hand corner is an illustration of a typical retardant drop. So even if you look at that picture of the air tanker dropping, those lines might look really uniform and really consistent. But if you look at this illustration down in the corner, you can see that they're not even end to end and they're not even side to side. Instead, there are areas where we get lighter coverage and heavier coverage, and if you could turn that drop on its side, it would look like a mountain range. The objective of the drop is to make that fire work as hard as possible to get to the other side, to get through that whole width of the retardant line. So one thing when you're out in the field to remember is that even if you think you're seeing a very consistent line of retardant, that's not necessarily the case. There's going to be areas of heavier and areas of lighter coverage, within the same drop. So that's all I have. That's really brief. If you guys ever have any questions, and I think this information is going to come up on the last slide as well, but this is my contact information. So, and with that, I think we're on to Julie.
Thanks, Shirley. I'll wait here for a second for me to come up. So again, I'm Julie Loffman, and today I'm going to be, there we go. So today I'm going to be, for my portion of the webinar, I'm going to include some of the early development of fire chemical avoidance areas and the inclusion into the interagency direction within the Red Book, which for some of you that are not aware, the Red Book is the interagency standards for fire and fire aviation operations. Then I was going to give you a brief presentation on the lawsuits and the NEPA efforts that resulted in that nationwide final environmental impact statement and the requirements within the record of decision. Then I'll summarize the requirements and implementation associated with that 2011 ROD direction, and then provide an overview of how these are accomplished in the field, and then finally kind of where you can find some guidance. So in 2000, the Forest Service and the Department of Interior developed guidelines to reduce the potential for delivery of aerially delivered retardant as a result of fish kills in water. These guidelines have been refined and updated since that time to include all fire chemicals. The direction was to avoid waterways using a 300-foot buffer. It provided direction for pilots. It also defined a waterway as being a body of water including lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, whether or not they contain aquatic life. And then it also directed agencies to implement emergency consultation, ESA emergency consultation procedures if adverse effects occurred to T&E species or designated critical habitat. The direction at the time allowed for 3 exceptions for use for both the Department of Interior and Forest Service, and the exceptions were for the protection of life and property, where no other tactics are available or other resource concerns trump the potential effects to aquatic life. So anybody unfamiliar with the site, this is just an image of the NIFC site. This is where you can find the Red Book. On the bottom part of the screen just shows where Chapter 12, and Chapter 12 is dedicated to fire chemicals. So as background information, the Forest Service was sued 2 times on the use of aerial fire retardant and lost in both cases. In 2003 on the grounds that the use of aerial delivered retardant is a proposed action and needed to complete NEPA. The Forest Service prepared an EA and a FONSI in 2007, and in 2008 there was another lawsuit against the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA Fisheries in relation to NEPA inconsistencies in the associated biological opinions. So in July 2010, the court ordered that all 3 agencies were to complete a national level programmatic EIS and national level consultations with NIMS and Fish and Wildlife Service by December 31st, 2011. And for some of the newer employees or others that may not remember, but the Undersecretary of Agriculture was at that time threatened with jail time and threatened with contempt of court. So this is not your normal level of, or typical normal level of NEPA. We also did some recent investigations about a month ago and found that this record of decision was the only one that was signed by the Chief of the Forest Service. Another note is the Forest Service continues to be FOIA'd on the information to ensure we're meeting our reporting requirements, so it's very important that our staffs understand and implement the requirements of this record of decision. So the proposed action for the new direction in the record of decision that was signed by the Chief only applies to National Forest System lands and only for aerial delivered retardant. The proposed action also acknowledged that misapplications can and they will occur. They just do. That's kind of what happens when you drop from an aircraft. It also provides for consideration of historic and cultural resources. It changed the exception for use for aerial delivered retardants in avoidance areas to use for the protection of life or public safety. It removed those other two exceptions for the Forest Service. It also included additional direction for pilots, and it also acknowledged that ESA consultation had been completed on forest system lands, that emergency consultation was not required, and they were to follow the direction laid out within the record of decision. We also updated the Red Book as well when the record of decision was signed. The direction for the Forest Service requires avoidance area mapping, annual coordination and reviews, and local and national reporting of retardant use and misapplication events into avoidance areas. So the Chief's decision and proposed action says aerial retardant drops are not allowed in mapped avoidance areas for this TEPCS, which are threatened, endangered, proposed candidate, and sensitive species, or in waterways. And so I'll just refer to species through the rest of my talk and not repeat that. So if it's a waterway, regardless if it's mapped in GIS on your map or it has a species on it, it's avoided. If you observe an intermittent stream that is dry but it's still mapped in your avoidance areas, it's still an avoidance area and should be avoided. So just don't assume that they are for water. It may be for another species or for some other resource. And again, water can still be applied in avoidance areas. Avoidance area mapping is for the most part to reduce and minimize impacts to species and waterways. There may be some other specific forest locations like water towers, etc., but by and large they are for protection of ESA-listed species. These maps are available on our website as well as other fire-specific platforms that Rob's going to be talking about in his talk. There's two types of avoidance areas that are mapped, aquatic and terrestrial, and Dave Austin, who's speaking after me, will be talking a little bit more in depth about those, as well as the cultural and heritage avoidance areas. The picture here on the right just shows perennial streams in blue, intermittent streams in green, and terrestrial areas in red. Sometimes critical areas may also be over in a perennial waterway, and this may be just to identify a specific critical habitat for a fish species. Again, the record of decision allows for forests to make changes to these maps, so these were not set in stone, so there is a process for forests to change these if new species are added or things like that. So these are not set in stone. I guess you can just change. There is a process of changing these. This is just a screenshot of our web page. There's a lot of things on here, but this is essentially where you get the maps. You can go and get the maps by region. You can get them by a large locator, so you can go to your forest and zoom into your specific area. These are geo-referenced. You can download these and put these into a mapping platform, Avenza, etc. We also have a new web app viewer. It's similar to Google Earth, and you can zoom directly into the site where you're at using this other application. The record decision required annual coordination, so coordination with the services annually or as needed to look at mapping changes or new species changes, look at other reporting requirements that you had done through the year that happened on a misapplication, and these are generally done by the regional or forest biologist. The other coordination within the Forest Service is to coordinate within ourselves between fire operations and resource staff, line officers, and pilots to discuss this pre-season, to talk about that these exist, to talk about the direction, to talk about what you're going to do.
These are usually done by fire staff with assistance from resources. And then finally, coordination requirements with our partners to discuss how we're going to operate under unified command, and this is typically done by fire operations staff. Sometimes these coordination meetings are combined with the annual review requirement, which again is to look at the avoidance maps, look at the direction, revisit that, talk about how to do the reporting process, what the follow-up requirements are specifically for species you may have. The bottom line is for each region and forest, you need to develop your own process based on your specific needs. So like one year you may need to change maps, and so you might need to meet with resource staff, or the next year you might just need to do education. So this is something that needs to be developed and implemented at your own local level. So the Forest Service and the Department of Interior have been reporting fire chemicals into waterways since 2008, including foams and gels. But since the record of decision was signed, the Forest Service has additional reporting requirements associated with aerial delivered retardant. Some of these are more specific, such as like distance to live water, water quality measurements, other species-specific items. Another additional reporting requirement is to monitor a subset of smaller fires where aerial retardant was used and avoidance areas were present. It also requires some additional local and upward national level reporting requirements. This is just a screenshot again of where to do this reporting. This is an online tool developed on the website. Many of you have been there, but again, those of you who have not, this is where you report misapplications for foams, gels, ground application, as well as what we're talking about today is the aerial delivered into mapped avoidance areas. This is a storehouse, so you can store all of your information at this storehouse associated with a misapplication. So again, use this. It's a great tool. So one of the most important things I want to get across to everyone is these initial observations can be done by anybody on a fire incident. It doesn't just have to be a resource advisor. There's the ability to report the incident and a follow-up with the resource advisors. And again, what's most important is there are no repercussion or adverse actions with reporting this misapplication. So one thing that I really wanted to kind of hit home with is this 5% reporting. We're at the 5-year mark here, and I still see some confusion as to why and who is really responsible for doing this reporting. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on this. So the reporting for this is for smaller fires where aerial retardant is used and avoidance areas are nearby. So the reason for this reporting is required is that the services were concerned that a misapplication may occur on these smaller fires where no ground personnel were present. There's a requirement to monitor 5% of fires that fit into the category of 300 acres or less, where aerial retardant was used and avoidance areas nearby. What this means that if you had 100 fires that were in this small criteria where they had aerial delivery and avoidance areas nearby, 5 of them would need to be looked at, go out and look at to see if a misapplication took place, and there is a minimum of 1 per year. So what it requires is fire operations to track the number of fires on their force that were in this category, 300 acres or less, and to know if retardant was used and avoidance areas were present. So if you have a fire such as that, you need to send staff out and take a look and work with resource staff to see if you need to do a misapplication report or if you have met the requirements. And finally, your forest is, if your forest has used retardant during that calendar year, you still need to take a look at that and do this end-of-year reporting so that we know that you are actually looking at this requirement of 300 acres and smaller. In the fall, the Washington office sends out reminders to the regions every November to remind staff that this is required. So this is just a screenshot of the reporting tool. This is what it looks like. Again, this is where you can do the 5% assessment of 5 of these smaller acreage fires. finally, this is the implementation guide. This is also on the website, but this is a pretty comprehensive guide that gives you, everybody, kind of directions on how to operate. So there's chapters for pilots, for fire operations, resources, how to do mapping. It talks about how to do an assessment. It talks about doing consultations. There's also a chapter on there for roles and responsibilities. There's also some tools. And then you can set up how you could do these seasonal duties and the annual training as well in there. So the importance of implementation is, the chief's intent is that the decision is implemented as it was laid out. Again, no repercussions of misapplications. These are tied to legal consultation and legal requirements. And the more and the better you report a misapplication, the better we can really understand the effects of species and their habitats. And so my take-home message for my part of this webinar is, again, use water in mapped avoidance areas when you can. The exception for use of aerial delivered retardants in avoidance areas is for the protection of life and public safety only. The other thing is, if you see it, just report it. It's everybody's job. It's not just resources' job or fire's job. It's just everybody's job to make sure we can maintain the use of this tool. And for fire operations to kind of step up and help us out with tracking these smaller fires so that we can ensure that we maintain this reporting requirement. And thanks, everybody. That's all I have. Dave, you're up next.
Wait for my slides to load here. Okay, hi everyone. I'll be talking about some of the resource advisor information associated with aerial fire retardant use. For those not familiar with this, is a Type 1 helicopter that's dipping out of a mobile retardant dip tank. So what I'm going to be covering in my portion is the Endangered Species Act consultation we did for the EIS for the use of fire retardant, the role of the resource advisor with the use of aerial fire retardant, some information examples on avoidance area. Julie touched on a little bit. I'll go more into a little bit on it. The reporting of aerial fire retardant misapplications into waterways or terrestrial avoidance areas, and then the process for conducting the assessment of the potential impacts and any monitoring associated with the misapplication. The consultation we did was we completed a National Programmatic Biological Opinion to cover Section 7 ESA consultation for both the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. This national consultation covered all listed threatened and endangered species on all national forests that use aerial application of fire retardant. Therefore, they do not need to be covered under the emergency consultation for the incident. We're finding in the last couple of years people are including the use of aerial fire retardant misapplications as part of the emergency consultation for an incident, which doesn't need to happen. This programmatic consultation's already considered that. You can mention the use of the retardant in the emergency biological assessment, but then you want to refer it to the chemical reporting process that Julie talked about. The consultation also set up a system of reporting and monitoring if a misapplication of retardant occurs within a mapped avoidance area, and the assessment of impacts for threatened and endangered species needs to be conducted by a qualified resource specialist. Some species under the Fish and Wildlife Service biological opinion also have additional reporting requirements, which may be for water quality monitoring after the misapplication has occurred. The resource advisor role with the use of aerial fire retardant is to need to work closely with the air operations and fire operations personnel. It's best to have a plan in place for when the incident management team comes in. That should be part of the pre-season planning. You should have a process set up for the tracking and mapping of retardant drops at the beginning of the incident. This will make your life easier throughout the incident as far as finding out where it was dropped. The resource advisor also needs to know the information on local species and avoidance areas. They should have the avoidance area maps for the incident and like Julie pointed out, you can go to the website and pull those up. They should have knowledge of the species of concern or have the protection measures that are associated with those species for the incident area they're working on. And they should know the terms and conditions associated with those species from the biological opinion. For non-local resource advisors that may go out of their area, I recommend going to their website and pulling the maps. The biological opinion is also posted for both the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service on that webpage that Julie showed earlier. As she mentioned, there's two types of avoidance areas. The aquatic avoidance areas are usually mapped with a 300-foot buffer on all waterways. Over the years, some of these buffers have been adjusted for certain species in coordination with local Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service offices with local regions or forests. In 2013, a lot of the intermittent streams were removed from most areas in Region 3, Region 5, and Region 6 of the Forest Service. Some species have a 600-foot buffer, such as the arroyo toad and mountain yellow-legged frog in California. And then in Region 8, there was additional, like a 500-foot buffer and additional buffers. What you need to do as a resource advisor is need to verify those buffer widths with the local resource specialist and check it with the biological opinion. The other avoidance area are the terrestrial avoidance areas, and these may include one or more locations of some listed species. They're usually buffered 300 foot around a known population or occupied habitat or designated critical habitat. And some forests have chosen to cover candidate and sensitive species as part of these terrestrial areas, such as on the San Bernardino, we have carbonate plant habitat areas that have sensitive, threatened, and endangered species all in one area. They also may overlap with with the aquatic avoidance areas. These are examples of the maps you can pull from the website. The one on the right is from the Boise National Forest. It shows the red areas being occupied aquatic habitat areas. The blues are those perennial waterways, and the yellow is the intermittent waterways. The one on the left is showing occupied mountain yellow-legged frog habitat, which is mainly in the riparian area, and that's a 600-foot buffer. You can see it's twice as wide as the blue buffer for the waterway. Next is the misapplication reporting form. This can be downloaded from the website that Julie showed earlier. Again, anyone on the incident can report a misapplication. They would notify the incident commander and the resource advisor or the local forest biological resources staff, who then would complete the remainder of the assessment of impacts to resources. You would need to determine if the exception for the protection of human life and public safety was used, or if it was an accidental drop, and document that, and then complete the reporting requirements using a reporting tool. This is just a little diagram showing that reporting process. Again, you notify the incident commander, you fill out the reporting tool or the form and send it into the reporting database. You contact the resource advisor, and then the appropriate assessment would be done after the fact when it's safe to go in and do so. This is an example of a misapplication into a royal toad area. This happened last year on the Blue Cup fire. It's about a coverage level of 8 gallons per 100 square feet. What was done for this was the initial misapplication form. There was a aquatic assessment form done. There was a terrestrial assessment form, and there were photos and maps attached. The site assessment forms, these forms are usually additional forms that go with the initial form. Again, they're done for the terrestrial assessment as well as the aquatic assessment. They should be done as soon as possible when it's safe to enter the fire area. They're used to collect water quality data or species-specific monitoring requirement information such as ground cover, amount area burned, those types of the fire characteristics. And again, you may need to fill out both the terrestrial and aquatic supplemental form for the same area, as in the case of amphibians. And here's the site, a copy of the site assessment form. Monitoring requirements, some of the species have monitoring requirements for water quality monitoring plan after an application or a misapplication has occurred, or they may have non-native species monitoring, such as for invasive weeds for terrestrial areas. The information gathered from the monitoring would go on that assessment form under the initial misapplication report. And you can add additional forms as needed. You can do it 30 days afterwards, a year afterwards, whatever. You can always add forms to the database. The 2011 EIS also considered historic and cultural resources that they may restrict the use of fire retardants in certain areas, such as pueblos or where there's petroglyphs, which are rock art. They're not mapped due to the sensitivity of these. The general areas need to be identified as part of the pre-attack or the wildland fire decision support system planning process. You would work with the local archaeologist in determining the assessment and reporting needs. Again, there's a form on the database for filling out for cultural resources. The important thing to know here is it's the forest decision whether to use this online reporting form or not. When it's reported online, a lot of the area is redacted, just the location and the impacts is shown that only the person that's the local archaeologist can view the total form. And that's for the safety of those sensitive areas. So in summary, the misapplication has been conducted in a national programmatic consultation. Again, you don't need to do emergency consultation for retardant use. The resource advisors need to know the avoidance area maps, the buffer widths, and the requirements for species that may be impacted by a misapplication. You need to work closely with the air operations and fire operations people for document and tracking of retardant use. And again, that whole misapplication reporting summary, that wildland fire chemical misapplication reporting database of where to get the forms and everything. And that is my part. I'll turn it over to Mr. Rob Budge.
Hello, everybody. This is Rob Budge. I'm one of the Deputy Fire Staff Officers here on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in Oregon, and wanted to talk today a little bit about some of the operational considerations we have with the use of retardant. I oversee fire planning for our forests. I've been very involved in the pre-planning side of retardant use. During the summertime, my forest hosts our share of incident management teams and uses a fair amount of retardant in some years. So I have the operational side on it, and then I'm also an air operations branch director, which is the person who oversees the aircraft on a large incident. So I've also seen how some other agencies and units handle retardant use. Also going through, I'd like to show you on some of the slides some of the different equipment that we use. Not quite sure how much fire experience out there, or everybody out there has, but if you haven't been around fire a lot, I'll try to cover some of the basic things that you might see and encounter. First off, this is what's called a K-Max helicopter. It's a Type 1 helicopter that we use. It holds about 700 gallons of retardant or water. This one has a fixed tank, but you'll also commonly see the helicopters with buckets. So there's your aircraft trivia for that slide. As far as an outline goes, we're going to talk about some pre-season planning, resource advisors, a little bit about fire operations, go through the ordering process for retardant, talk about some of the direction that pilots need, talk about tracking retardant yet again, and a little bit about mobile retardant bases. And this is a picture of a retardant drop from a large air tanker. That's about 2,500 gallons of retardant. And for future reference, if you're taking pictures like this, you are way too close to where the retardant is. That's a pretty serious safety concern, so please keep that in mind. We'll talk a little bit about pre-season planning. The big thing with preseason planning is to identify those avoidance areas early on. It really helps to get everything mapped out well before fire season occurs. It makes it quite a bit easier, not nearly as much pressure to try to get things planned out at the last second. All of the retardant avoidance areas that we have should be uploaded into WFDS, which is the Wildland Fire Decision Support System. It's the computer program we use to help make decisions on wildfires and also document those decisions. And it's really neat because when you have a fire, you draw your little planning area box and all those retardant areas will pop up, retardant avoidance areas will pop up so you can see where those are. It does take a little while to get those loaded in to WFDS, so it's definitely a preseason project. The next thing I'd recommend is that each unit really identify the roles and responsibilities for retardant tracking and mapping and things like that. If you don't have someone identified to handle retardant and the tracking, it just doesn't work well, and it gets left out and doesn't happen, and we just can't have that. So definitely a good idea to get roles clearly identified. Briefing packets and delegations are another preseason thing you could be working on. When an incident management team comes in, they're called in to manage a fire when it exceeds the local unit's capabilities. They're given a packet, which is either a 3-ring binder or a stack of papers that has all the critical information that they need to manage that incident. And that's where including retardant avoidance direction is very helpful to those incident management teams. Also, retardant avoidance and tracking gets mentioned in a lot of the delegations of authority that they are given to manage that incident. And another preseason task that can happen is identifying dip sites, helibases, potential places for mobile retardant bases. That way you don't have to scramble at the last minute to try to find places that are away from sensitive areas. The picture here, this is an Erickson air crane. They hold about 2,500 gallons of retardant. They're one of the larger aircraft we have in the fleet, and you'll commonly see those involved in retardant operations when we use helicopters to deliver that product. Talking a little bit about resource advisors, the biggest thing is be fire ready, and I tell folks it's always fire season somewhere, so I would suggest everybody's ready to go pretty much year round. Having a red card or incident qualification card in hand before fire season is key. I've run into it where we've had people we wanted to use as resource advisors and they didn't have a PAC test or they hadn't completed an annual refresher, and then we weren't able to use that person, and it really created some problems for us. I'd recommend for resource advisors taking a little bit of time to brush up on the use of retardant and gels and foams. There's lots of information on the internet about that, training materials from various courses, lots of places to look for it, and probably worth some time to go back and just brush up before fire season hits. Attending a resource advisor read refresher. It's a great place to determine who's responsible for what, and also to make sure that the standards that your unit has for retardant use and reporting are well known to everybody. Next thing is be readily available. It's amazing how people just sort of scatter to the winds on the weekends or after hours, and it's hard to get a hold of folks. As a resource advisor, there really should be like a rotation or an on-call person so that we can get a hold of people when we need to. It's very frustrating when we have some time-critical decisions to make and we can't find resource advisors, so be available. Stay engaged. That means taking the initiative to talk to a line officer, find out what their wishes are, offer assistance when you know there's fire in a sensitive area, things like that. And the last thing for resource advisors, and probably the most helpful thing, is have current data. With thumb drives, the technology we have now with geo-reference, PDF maps, and other things, there's a lot of information out there, and if the resource advisor has that in a format that they can hand off to somebody, that really makes it a lot easier to make sure we put the retardant where we want to. Talking about fire operations, first off is a picture of a burnout operation. These guys are shooting very pistol rounds out into the brush to burn out a fire line, something you'll see fairly commonly. But for fire operations, ground personnel need to know where these retardant avoidance areas are. It was mentioned earlier, avoidance areas are everyone's responsibility. Reporting misapplications is everyone's responsibility. And we move crews all over the country. We have a lot of people working on fires who haven't been in those areas before. So very important that they know where the avoidance areas are. It's important that that information gets provided to pilots and to the Air Tactical Group Supervisor, also called an Air Attack. or an ATGS. Their job is to oversee the aircraft that are flying up in the air. If that air attack person knows where the avoidance areas are, they can pass that on to the air tankers, and it makes it a lot cleaner, and it's one less thing the people on the ground have to worry about quite so much. I'd really recommend requesting resource advisors early. I try to get folks to request reads even at initial attack, because if it turns out we catch the fire and we don't need the read, you can always turn them around. But the earlier the reads involved, the better our chances are that things will go well for us. Be sure we're providing timely feedback to pilots. If they make a drop and it hits an avoidance area, or if they're getting close to an avoidance area, they need that feedback right away, not 30 minutes later or an hour later when they come back with another load of retardant. The next thing I have is be sure to let the air attack person manage the air resources. That's what they do, and that's what they're very good at. If you have feedback about drops and there is an air attack there, you can go direct to the air attack and they can pass on that information to the pilot, so you don't have to necessarily worry about talking to the pilots directly. Anytime you're out on the ground as a resource advisor or involved in ground operations, you need to be monitoring the air-to-ground frequency in your radio. Gives you a good heads up of what's going on, lets you know if there's retardant on the way, and that's also the frequency you're going to need if you do have to talk to an aircraft for some reason. We've already mentioned it several times, everyone or anyone can report misapplication of retardant. And we do have the capability to use retardant or water out of the aircraft. Just keep in mind that if we use plain water, the first couple drops will probably have some residual retardant in them. So it's not like we're going to get just plain water straight off for the first load. There will be a little bit of residual there. Also, as was mentioned earlier, water doesn't last as long as retardant does. So if we're dropping water out of aircraft, that's an okay decision to be made, but we just need to realize that may not be the most efficient use of that aircraft. So that just needs to factor into the decision process. A little bit about the process for ordering retardant. The authority to order retardant rests with the incident commander for that fire. The incident commander is the person in charge of the whole fire. Every fire only has one incident commander, and it's going to be as stated in their delegation of authority. Most places allow incident commanders to order retardant. There are a few places that may have an additional layer of approval that needs to happen before an order can actually be placed. If that incident commander does have the authority to order retardant, they will typically delegate that to the air attack, and orders typically go through the air attack person. Once the decision is made to use retardant, the order is called in by radio to the local dispatch center. That dispatch center will turn around and put an order into the ROS system and fill that order with the closest available aircraft that meets the mission requirements. It could be an aircraft that's in the local area. It could be one coming from quite a ways away. When we order retardant, or we order air tankers, we typically order a lead plane to go with those. That's a small plane that comes in ahead of the air tanker. Make sure it's safe for the tanker to fly that route, and it also shows the tanker exactly where we want the retardant delivered. Air tanker orders get prioritized based on values that are the values that are at risk. Fires that have an imminent threat to human life, they will tend to get there. They will be prioritized higher than other values. Threats to natural resources and threats to low-value structures tend to be down at the bottom of the list. So also keep in mind, just because you hear retardant's been ordered or people are thinking about using retardant, it doesn't mean they'll actually get it. This picture here is of a DC-10 air tanker. It's the largest one we currently use on the federal side of things. And when they're carrying a full load, that's about 12,000 gallons of retardant. So definitely a whole lot of retardant. They can cover a very large area very quickly with those type of aircraft. On the other end of the spectrum, this is a single engine air tanker. This is the smallest of the air tankers we use. These are often used as crop dusters, and they carry about 800 gallons. The big difference with these is the single engine air tankers are a little more maneuverable. They're also single pilot, so you have one person trying to do a whole lot of things, which can keep them very busy. As far as pilot and air attack direction, very important they get quality in-briefings. That may be in person in an airport or over the radio, but that's where they find out those key avoidance areas that we have or what the mission is of the day. Very importantly, you recognize pilot limitations. For example, with this aircraft, you have one pilot flying the aircraft, maybe listening to 3 or 4 different radios at the same time, flying at high speeds, low level, and trying to put retardant exactly where you want it. Usually they're very good at it. Sometimes they miss with the retardant. The biggest thing is we want to keep those pilots safe and keep the aircraft safe. So there will be times where they will just have to drop the load and do what they can to save the aircraft. So remember, pilots have limitations and they can only do so many things at one time. Knowing the capabilities of aircraft really go a long way. If you're the one ordering retardant, it gives you a good idea of what type of aircraft will work and what won't. And it's important that everyone understands that not all aircraft are equipped the same. Some have fancy GPS units that can track drops, some don't. Some are flying with the latest and greatest technology from 2017. Others are still using paper maps. So definitely it depends on the aircraft. With the newer aircraft that do have the GPS capabilities, that data is not necessarily available to the field units. It's more of a Washington office national type of thing. So don't try to get the retardant locations from the pilots directly. It's best that that just comes out in a map that the air attacks prepare or that you get after the pilot's landed. Talking a little about tracking retardant. Tracking retardant drops is everyone's job. Having a plan in place for your unit makes it work a lot better. Something to be discussed pre-season. It's just another one of those pre-season things. Be sure to track all the drops even during initial attack. Trying to figure out what happened during initial attack is usually the most difficult part of finding out where retardant went. If you have an incident management team in place, be sure they have clear direction on the reporting instructions. That is what to report and who to report to. When tracking retardant drops, the location is usually more important than the exact quantity delivered. So location is more important than gallons. And as I mentioned, some aircraft have the technology to track the drops, but at the local unit, that data is not currently available. Last thing I want to talk about real quickly are mobile retardant bases. Starting to see more and more of these, particularly when we have very high values at risk. They're used for helicopters or they can be used at air tanker bases. The thing with mobile retardant bases is resource advisors need to engage early. This is a picture of a mobile retardant base on the Umpqua National Forest here in Oregon. And as you can see, it takes a fairly large footprint and large area. It takes several hours to set these up, but when the base rolls in, there's usually an urgency to get it up and going. So that's where resource advisors need to be available very early on. Mobile retardant bases need to be located near a water source. That can be problematic if you're pumping water out of a stream or a creek, because as the aircraft fly out, there's the potential for retardant to drip into that waterway. So that's where we have to be very careful where we site these or where we locate these operations. Not all aircraft can deliver all products. With the fixed tanks on aircraft, there's only one product that's approved for use in those fixed tanks due to corrosion. So that can be a limiting factor for us sometime. Need to remember to track all the retardant that the helicopters are delivering, and just the same as we would with an air tanker. And the last thing with these mobile retardant bases is you need to have a plan for how to dispose of the unused retardant. At the end of these operations, there could be 10 or 15,000 gallons of unused retardant that you need to get rid of. That could be putting it in a water tender and going and spraying it on the fire or in a farmer's field or something like that. We don't want to fly that off with the aircraft because it's a risk management issue and it's also a cost issue. So if we can dispose of that with ground resources, that's the best bet. That's what I had for you today. Like everyone else, my contact information is on the next slide if you have any other questions. Thank you.
This is Tracy Hickman. We started a few minutes late, so we're going to take a few minutes to see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. Emilio, can you describe how people ask questions? So if you have a question, just press *6 on your phone, and that will unmute your phone. So Julie, do you want to answer that first question? Do we report intentional misapplications differently? I believe the question would be about an exception.
Hold on a second. Let me find the first question. The first question is, If a misapplication occurs, oh, wait a minute, I am not seeing it. It's not coming up in my full screen. Can you read that for me? Tracy, can you see that? I can't see that first question, if a misapplication occurs.
The question is, do we report intentional misapplications differently?
Intentional misapplication. So you're saying an exception to the use. So no, it is reported exactly the same. So a accidental misapplication or an intentional using the exception are reported the same way, and the same analysis of effects is done exactly the same way. So on the reporting form, there's a checkbox in there saying, is it accidental or is it the exception for use?
Okay, the next question was, are these presentations available to review again somewhere?
So we generally, I'll answer that. This is Julie. We provide all of our training PowerPoints on the O drive, and there is a location in the guide that directs you where we present or where we file all of those training PowerPoints. For those of you that are non-Forest Service and don't have access to our O drive, just give me a call. Again, I'm Julie. And we can see about getting these over to you so you can use those as well.
So Julie, there's a follow-up to that first question. They're not talking about an exception, and the question or the statement is wherein the IC uses the riparian area to enhance retardant.
Say that again. So do we report intentional misapplications differently? So I did that. Scott, not an exception. Where an IC uses the riparian area to enhance retardant. I'm not sure what that's asking. Not an exception where an IC uses the riparian to enhance retardant.
This is Scott. I can do it over the phone. So I've had ICs actually fly the retardant down the creek because they thought it would hold better. It's more common with the state agencies, but unfortunately they do have protection over Forest Service lands in some areas.
Right. So the other state agencies have to follow the requirement of the Forest Service direction on forest system lands. That is not something that they do, I guess is the right answer. What's done on other private lands, non-DOI, non-Forest Service, that's their own purview to apply however they decide to apply. And
yeah, I understand that, but they do it on Forest Service lands, or they have. So what I wanted to know is there something I'm supposed to do, because I know they're not supposed to, and that they're supposed to comply with our regulations. That doesn't always mean that they do. So,
do you want to just give me a call after this, and we can kind of talk about some ideas how to do that?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, that'd be great. Well, I don't see any more questions. So what we're going to do is we are going to capture all of these questions, and as soon as we compile all of the questions from all of the webinars, and then we're going to have the best webinar, we're going to post that to the Aerial Fire Retardant website, so we can have that information after we do the last webinar, which is in June. Tracy, did I forget anything else?
No, I think you captured it.
Okay.
I think you captured it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And again, if you know of anyone else that wants to attend these webinars, please, let them know that we are going to have another one, and we thank you all for attending.